Drops of sweat ran down my back as I performed the last pull-up. 60 pounds wasn't the limit, but it was enough for a morning workout. The metallic clanking of iron, the muffled conversations of the few customers, and the quiet background music created the familiar atmosphere of my little kingdom. FitLife isn't the biggest fitness club in Philadelphia, but it's definitely one of the coziest. At least that's what I've always believed. "Hey, Bright, can you check out my technique?" James, a regular who works a couple blocks away at an insurance company, called out to me. I set the barbell aside and walked over to him. Tuesday mornings aren't the busiest times. You can give everyone attention. "Keep your back straight and bend your knees a little." I demonstrated the proper position. "Like this. And take your time." Each repetition should be crisp. My gaze slid to the wall clock. 8:30. Valencia should have opened her flower store by now. I wondered how her new orchid collection she'd been talking about all last week was doing. She hadn't talked much about work lately, and not just about work either. "Thanks, Bright." James wiped his neck with a towel. "How's little Ethan doing? Still dreaming of being a superhero?" I smiled involuntarily, remembering my son running around the house yesterday in a homemade cape made from his mom's scarf. Now he's decided to become a paleontologist. Found some excavation video on the internet, and now the whole house is littered with drawn dinosaurs. 6 is the right age for such hobbies, James laughed. My nephew is picking a new profession every week at that age. I headed over to the receptionist's desk where Sarah, our new manager, was sorting through the morning mail. Her red hair was gathered, and her second glass of coffee was already on the desk. "Anything important?" "Bills, ads, and..." She waved an envelope. "Another offer to buy the space. 3rd one this month." I shook my head. This new chain of fitness clubs had been trying to buy our building for 6 months. But I wasn't about to sell my life's work. "You can throw it away right away." Wiping my face with a towel, I pulled out my phone. No message from Valencia. Weird, she usually texted when she got to the store. The last 2 weeks, though, she'd been kind of distant. Maybe I should have had a serious talk with her like Paige had suggested. Although the advice of my wife's best friend wasn't always good for me. "Brighton, Mr. Foster here has signed up for personal training by 10. Sarah's voice snapped me out of my musings. "You remember, don't you?" "Of course." I glanced at my watch. Another hour. Enough time to check the equipment in the weight room and review the workout program for new clients. As I walked past the mirrored wall, I noted absent-mindedly that I should trim my beard. At 36, I still looked good. The regular workouts were doing their job. Valencia often joked that it was my physique that had caught her eye the night we'd first met at the charity marathon. I was working as a trainer and dreaming of owning my own gym, while she had recently moved from Mexico and was working part-time at a flower store while studying to be a florist. Her phone vibrated. A message from the bank had come in to write off the monthly payment on her gym loan. 4 years ago, this decision seemed risky, but Valencia's support gave her confidence. She always knew how to find the right words to cheer me up in difficult moments. Even when my father refused to help with the down payment, calling it pointless, it was Valencia who convinced me not to give up. "Hey, handsome," came a familiar voice. I turned around. Paige was standing at the entrance, dressed in a trendy tracksuit. "Thought I'd stop by for a morning workout." 3 weeks off and here you are again?" I grinned. "Valencia get bored with your lectures on the importance of sports?" A strange shadow ran across Paige's face. "Nah, just missed our cozy gym. By the way, haven't seen Valencia in a couple days. She said she was going to go to the wholesale market to pick up a new batch of flowers." "Really?" I frowned. She didn't say anything like that to me. "Oh, I must be confused about something." Paige hurriedly headed toward the locker room. "I'll see you in the gym." Something about her demeanor struck me as odd, but I didn't have time to finish the thought before Mr. Foster entered the gym, arriving earlier than scheduled. The next hour flew by. We practiced basic exercises and made a training program. "Good job," I praised him at the end of the workout. "Next time we'll add some cardio." After seeing the client off, I noticed that Paige had already left without even saying goodbye. It wasn't that important, though. It was getting close to lunchtime, and I was going to stop by the house for a bite to eat. Valencia usually made her signature chicken burrito on Tuesdays, Her grandmother's recipe from Mexico City. "Sarah, I'll be gone for an hour," I shouted to the receptionist. "If there's an emergency, call me." Getting in the car, I checked my phone again. No message from my wife. Maybe I should stop by her store. Valencia's Flowers was only 15 minutes away, but something inside told me to go home. A strange, unsettling feeling that I had no way of explaining. When I parked in front of the house, I noticed immediately that the garage was empty. Valencia's car wasn't there. Unusual for a Tuesday, she usually came home for lunch. Climbing the porch steps, I pulled out my keys and froze. The front door was unlocked. Inside the house, there was an unaccustomed silence. No cooking smells from the kitchen, no TV noise from the living room, where Ethan usually watched his dinosaur cartoons. Only the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway, Valencia's gift to us for our first anniversary, disturbed that oppressive silence. "Valencia?" I called out, walking into the living room. "Ethan?" My response was silence. And then I noticed something had changed. The family photos that always stood on the mantelpiece were gone. Every single one of them. The emptiness of the mantelpiece was more deafening than any scream. Where our wedding photo used to stand was now just a light rectangle on the faded wallpaper. Next to it was always a picture of Ethan's newborn in the hospital, his first birthday, our vacation at Disneyland last summer. It was all gone. "Valencia!" My voice echoed through the empty house. I rushed upstairs, jumping over the stairs. Ethan's nursery was the first on the left. I swung the door open and froze. The bed is made, but the desk is empty. No sign of his favorite dinosaur nightstand, or the box of pencils we bought last week. In the closet, half the hangers are empty. Gone are his favorite jeans with patches, the blue hooded jacket, the one he didn't want to be photographed in for his school pictures. Bedroom, our bedroom. The door gave in with the usual creak. The hinges should have been oiled last week, but I hadn't gotten around to it. Valencia's closet was empty. The only things left were a few old dresses and home clothes. Her bedside table was empty. Even the little mirror in front of which she painted her lips every morning was gone. In the bathroom, the same picture. Her makeup bag, her favorite perfume bottles, even her toothbrush were gone. It was as if someone had methodically erased all traces of her presence in the house. Back in the bedroom, I noticed an envelope on the bed. White, no writing. Inside was a doubled folded piece of paper and a note written in familiar handwriting. "I'm sorry, but I can't live like this anymore. Ethan and I are leaving. Please don't try to look for us. It would be best for everyone. P.S. I took our savings. Consider it compensation for the lost years." My knees went weak, and I sank heavily to the edge of the bed. One thought pounded in my head. This can't be happening. This is some kind of mistake. With shaky hands, I pulled out my cell phone, dialed Valencia's number, caller, unavailable. Again and again, same result. Opened WhatsApp. The last message from her was last night. "Don't forget to buy milk on your way home." An ordinary, everyday message, nothing foreboding. A banking app. Login, password, joint account, $0. Ethan's college savings account, $0. Personal account, minus $120, morning charge for coffee and gas. Think. I squeezed my temples with my palms. When was the last time I'd seen them? Last night. It had been business as usual. Valencia was cooking dinner chicken soup with corn, her signature dish. Ethan was talking about his new dinosaur game at recess. I promised to take him to the Natural History Museum this weekend. Getting out of bed, I started to walk around the room. My eyes clung to details I hadn't noticed before. The jewelry box was gone. The photo albums from the bottom drawer of the dresser, gone. Her favorite blanket brought back from Mexico, gone. She planned it. She was preparing, and I hadn't noticed. Going down to the kitchen, I opened the refrigerator. The food containers stood untouched. Last night's soup, vegetables, Ethan's yogurt. Everything looked normal. There was a cup of coffee on the table. I touched it. It was cold. The clock on the microwave read 1 o'clock. I had to get back to the gym. I have practice with Mrs. Peterson at 2. Practice. How could I think about working out right now? Phone's back in my hand. A call to Valencia's Flowers. "Valencia's Flowers? How can I help you?" Marta's voice, her assistant. Martha, this is Brighton. Was Valencia in the store today? A pause. A pause too long. No, Mr. Ramsey. She sent word that she's taking an indefinite vacation. She asked me to keep an eye on the store. So it's all worked out there, too. Thank you, Martha. I pressed off without waiting for a reply. Paige. She must know something. Her strange behavior this morning, those words about the wholesale market. I dialed the number and it said, unavailable. Of course. Phone vibrated in my pocket. Sarah from the hall. Bright, Mrs. Peterson called to confirm practice. Will you be there? The voice sounded like it came from far away. How could I explain that my world had just collapsed? No. I struggled to say the words. Cancel all my training for today. Tell them I'm sick. Is something wrong? There was concern in Sarah's voice. Just cancel. I dropped the call. I went upstairs again, to Ethan's nursery. Sat on his bed, ran my hand over the dinosaur bedspread. Just last night I'd covered him with that blanket, read him a story about a tyrannosaurus who wanted to be a ballerina. Ethan laughed, said it was a silly story. What kind of a tyrannosaurus is a ballerina? And now, there were drawings taped to the wall, the ones Valencia hadn't taken away. Dinosaurs, superheroes, our family, 3 figures holding hands. To the best dad, was the crooked inscription at the bottom. I ripped the drawing off the wall, folded it neatly, and tucked it into my pocket. The phone rang again. The bank. Mr. Ramsey? This is John Ferguson at First National Bank. We've had some unusual activity on your accounts. Large sums of money were withdrawn this morning. I know. I interrupted him. It's my wife. She has access to the accounts. Yes, but given the size of the transactions, we're required to notify the account holder. I'd also like to remind you that tomorrow is the scheduled payment on the business loan. The loan. Damn. I totally forgot about the hall credit. The monthly payment is $3,000. Money I don't have now. Mr. Ramsey, can you hear me? Yes. My voice sounded hoarse. Yeah, I'll call you back later. There was a pounding in my temples. How could she do this? Take not only her son, but all the money? The money we'd saved together. The money we needed to pay off the loan, for Ethan's future. A diplodocus-shaped clock hung on the nursery wall, a present from my last birthday. The hands showed the beginning of the second. It had only been an hour since I'd gotten home, and it seemed like an eternity. I went down to the living room and sat in my favorite chair. How many evenings we'd spent here together, me in the chair, Valencia on the couch with a book, Ethan on the floor with his toys. The house was dead silent now, broken only by the ticking of the clock. His gaze fell on the mantelpiece, those empty spaces from the photos again. I stood up, walked closer. The dust showed clear traces of the frames. I ran my finger along the dusty trail, the last material connection to what had been my life that morning. Reality rolled in with a new wave. I could lose not only my family, but my life's work. The gym I had built from the ground up, a place that had become a second home to so many. It was falling apart, crumbling like a house of cards, and I didn't know what to grab first. I went back to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the sink. There, behind the cereal cans, was a bottle of whiskey, a gift from a grateful customer last Christmas. I'd never been a fan of hard liquor, but now... My hand froze halfway to the bottle. No, not this. Not now. I need a clear head. I have to find them. I have to get my son back. I have to understand why she did what she did. But where do I start? The police? A lawyer? Private investigator? There were too many questions and not one answer. The evening descended on Philadelphia with a dank fog. I sat in the empty hall, going over bills and trying to find some way out of the situation. Sarah had already gone home, having preemptively canceled all my workouts for tomorrow. The bank clerks were gone too. After a 3-hour conversation, it was clear that there would be no loan deferment. Business is business, Mr. Ramsey. My gaze fell on a photograph on the wall, the opening of the hall, 4 years ago. Me, Valencia, little Ethan with a balloon in his hand. My heart clenched again. How could she do that? Take all our savings, leave me with debt? The phone was silent. I called the police, but they were predictably useless. Your wife had the legal right to withdraw the money from the account. And the child is her son. Without a court order, there's nothing we can do. On the phone screen was a picture of Ethan. It was taken a month ago, at the park. He's sitting on a swing, smiling full mouth, showing a recently lost baby tooth. Valencia said at the time to put the tooth under a pillow for the tooth fairy. And I insisted that he was too big for such fairy tales. Think, Bright, think. I stood up and started walking down the hall. The light from the street lamps reflected in the mirrored walls, creating bizarre shadows. Where could she have gone? To Mexico to visit relatives. But she only had distant cousins there, with whom she barely spoke. Or so I thought. The last few weeks replayed over and over in my mind. Were there signs? Something I should have noticed? Her strange brooding, the long phone conversations that cut off when I walked into the room. And Paige. Paige definitely knew something. I pulled out my phone, dialed Paige's number again, still unavailable. Opened Facebook. Her profile was gone. Instagram, same thing. It was like she'd vanished with Valencia. There was a stack of bills on the table. Rent, utilities, employee paychecks, a loan. How could I pay for all that? Valencia had taken everything, even the money set aside for taxes. She knew without that money, I'd lose the gym. She knew, and she did it anyway. In the corner of the gym was an old weight machine, the first one I'd bought when I opened the gym. My dad said at the time that I was making a mistake. Business isn't about toys, Brighton. You have no idea what you're getting into, Father. The last time we spoke was 10 years ago. That night was still in front of my eyes. His office in their old house, the collection of military decorations on the wall, the photos from his duty stations. You disappoint me, son. I was hoping you'd follow in my footsteps. And you want to waste your life on some gym? I left then, slamming the door. Pride wouldn't let me admit that maybe he was right. I didn't even invite him to the wedding. I only sent him a picture. He responded with a short, "Congratulations," and a check for $1,000, which I never cashed. The phone in my pocket vibrated. An unknown number. Hello? Mr. Ramsey, this is Rosa, Mrs. Cortez's neighbor from Mexico City. Valencia asked me to tell you to... Valencia, have you spoken to her? Where is she? I jumped up, clutching the phone. Lo siento, I can't say. She just asked me to tell you that Ethan is okay, and that it's what's best for everyone. Wait, please. But the phone was already ringing off the hook. Mexico City, so she's there after all. But it's a huge city, and I have no connections or knowledge of how to find someone in Mexico. Unless... I opened up my phone contacts, scrolled down to the letter O. Father. A contact I hadn't called in 10 years. My finger hovered over the call button. Colonel Cameron Ramsey. 30 years of military service. Lots of connections in government circles. If anyone could help me find Valencia in Mexico. But asking him for help? After everything that's been said? After 10 years of silence? All I could hear in the room was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant noise of cars from the street. I stared at my phone, remembering all those moments when pride wouldn't let me make the first move. Ethan's birth, I'd only sent a picture. Birthdays, Christmas, Father's Day. Only formal cards. And he was the only one who could really help. Sometimes you have to be able to admit your mistakes, son, my dad liked to say. Maybe it was time to heed his words. I pressed the call button. The ringing seemed endless. 1, 2, 3. Ramsey here. His voice hadn't changed much over the years. Still firm, commanding. Papa. The word was hard to say. This is Brighton. The silence on the phone seemed to last an eternity. What's wrong? He finally asked. Of course, he realized I wouldn't just call. I took a deep breath. I need your help. Valencia took Ethan and went to Mexico. Took all the money, left me with debts. I could lose the gym. Silence again. I could almost see him sitting in his office, probably still in the same leather chair, mulling over every word. Is the address the same? He finally asked. Yes. I'll be there in an hour. The call ended. I sank down on the bench, feeling the tension of the last few hours begin to let go. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he'd just say, "I told you so," and walk away. But I had no other options. I stood up, looking around the room. I had to lock everything up, check the doors. Tomorrow was going to be a tough conversation, and I might have to admit a lot more of my mistakes. Exactly an hour later, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. Looking out the hall window, I saw a familiar black SUV, the same Ford my father had driven 10 years ago. Some things don't change. I opened the door before he could knock. Colonel Cameron Ramsey stood in the doorway straight back, military bearing, graying whiskers. Only the wrinkles had increased, and there was a new tiredness in his eyes. "Hello, son." He extended his hand for a handshake. Formal, businesslike, as if we'd parted yesterday, not 10 years ago. "Hello, Dad." I shook his hand. "Come on in." He walked into the room, looking around at the equipment, the mirrored walls, the advertising posters on the walls. Lingered his gaze on the opening photo. "Not bad," he finally said. "Better than I expected." The words made something squeeze inside. How many years had I waited for his approval? And now that it finally came through, it was all crumbling. "Tell it from the beginning." He sat down on the bench against the wall. "And take your time." I started to tell the story. About coming home and finding the house empty. About the note. About the missing money. About the call from Mexico City. My voice trailed off as I talked about Ethan, about reading him a story the night before, not realizing it was the last time. Dad listened in silence, not interrupting. Only the jowls went on his cheekbones as I talked about the bank accounts and the loan. "How much time did they give?" he asked when I finished. 3 days until the next payment. Then they'll start foreclosure proceedings." He pulled out his phone, looked at the time. "It's getting late. Let's go to my house now. We'll talk it over there. You need to eat and rest." "I can't rest. My son is somewhere in Mexico. I have to." "That's why you need a clear head." His tone tolerated no objection. "Pack." On the drive to his house, we were silent. I stared out the window at nighttime Philadelphia, remembering how often I'd traveled this road as a kid. There's the supermarket where we bought groceries on Saturdays. The high school where I went to school. The park where my father taught me to ride my bike. The house greeted us with dark windows and the smell of an uninhabited room. "Your mother's gone to visit her sister in Florida for a month," my father explained, turning on the light in the hallway. "Come into the kitchen." Everything in here was the same as it had been 10 years ago. The same floral wallpaper my mom had picked out. The same wooden key rack by the door. Even the old family photos on the walls. Me as a kid, school pictures, graduation. In the kitchen, my father pulled containers of food out of the refrigerator. "Your mother cooked before she left. Sit down." I didn't feel hungry, but I knew it was useless to argue. While dinner was warming up, my father poured us both coffee, black, no sugar, like we always drank. "So, Mexico City," he pronounced, sitting down across from us. "Do you have an address for that neighbor lady who called?" "No, the number came up as unknown. I tried calling back, but..." "Never mind," he waved it off. "I have a friend at the consulate. I'll contact him first thing tomorrow morning." The microwave beeped. Dad pulled out a plate of Mom's signature meatloaf. The smell hit my nose, bringing unexpected tears. How many times had I run home to that smell as a child? "Eat up." My father slid the plate toward me. "And tell me about my grandson. I've only seen him in pictures." I began to tell him about Ethan, about his fascination with dinosaurs, about him learning to read, about his first day of school. With each word, the lump in my throat got bigger. How could she deprive me of all that? "What about her friend, the one who was in the gym today?" "Paige?" I set my fork aside. "She's disappeared. All her social media accounts have been deleted. Her phone's been disconnected." Dad tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "She's in on it too. We need to check her movements, her bank transactions. But how? I don't have that kind of capability." "I do," he finished his coffee. 30 years of service accumulates certain connections. Tomorrow we'll get started." I glanced at my watch, almost midnight. It seemed unbelievable that as early as this morning I was still doing my workout at the gym and Valencia and Ethan were home. Your room upstairs has been left untouched. Dad got up from the table. Go get some rest. You'll need your strength tomorrow. I climbed the familiar stairs. The door to my old room creaked open, the same sound I'd heard as a child. Inside, everything was still as it was. Posters of my favorite athletes on the walls, bookshelves, an old desk. My mom had even made the bed, as if she'd been waiting for my return all these years. Here, Dad came into the room, setting a glass of whiskey on the nightstand. Sometimes it helps. I wanted to refuse, but he was already out, quietly closing the door. In the silence of the house, I could hear his footsteps down the hall, the creak of the floorboards in his office. Scraps of memories flashed through my mind. The first time I'd met Valencia at the charity marathon, her laughter when I'd clumsily tried to say something in Spanish, our wedding, Ethan's birth. Where did I go wrong? What had I done wrong? My phone vibrated. A message from Sarah. Bright, are you okay? Do you need help? I didn't answer. What difference does it make now? In 3 days, I'd lose the gym. Everything I'd spent years building would crumble like a house of cards. I lay on the bed without undressing. The glowing stars I'd glued on as a child, some still glimmered faintly in the darkness, looked up from the ceiling. How many nights had I spent looking at them and dreaming of the future? A future that was now crumbling before my eyes. In the next room, my father was talking quietly on the phone. Apparently, he'd already started to pull up his connections. Strangely, his presence was comforting. It was like when I was a child, when it seemed that my father could solve any problem. My eyes were sleepy from fatigue and whiskey. The last thought before falling into a heavy sleep was the phrase from Valencia's note. It will be better for everyone. But how could losing a father be better for a child? I awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of muffled voices from downstairs. I stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, trying to figure out where I was. Then reality hit me hard. The empty house, the note, the disappearance of Valencia and Ethan. The clock on the bedside table read 7 in the morning. An empty whiskey glass stood next to it, a reminder of last night. My head was buzzing and my mouth was dry. On another morning, I'd be at the gym getting ready for my first customers. Ethan would be getting ready for school, and Valencia would be making his favorite blueberry pancakes. I sat up on the bed, rubbing my face with my hands. My phone showed a few missed calls from Sarah and one message from the bank, a reminder of an upcoming loan payment. Like I could forget about it. There were voices downstairs again. My dad was talking to someone. I got up and walked over to the old dresser. It still had my high school picture on it, me in my soccer uniform, smiling for the camera. A carefree teenager who thought all of life was ahead of me and everything would be easy. After washing up in the bathroom, so familiar, with the cracked tile by the mirror and the squeaky faucet, I went down to the kitchen. My father was sitting at the table with a man in an austere suit. Papers lay in front of them. Good morning. Father looked up. There's coffee in the coffee pot. This is Michael Donovan, an old friend of mine from the consular service. The man stood up, extended his hand. I'm sorry for your situation, Mr. Ramsey. The colonel gave me the details. I mechanically shook the outstretched hand, poured myself a cup of coffee. My hands shook slightly, and some of the coffee spilled onto the countertop. It was the same way my hands had shaken yesterday, when I'd read Valencia's note. Have a seat. Dad nodded to a vacant chair. Michael has already started working on our case. I have some news. Donovan opened a leather folder. Your wife and son have indeed entered Mexico. Crossed the border yesterday morning through Mexico City International Airport. There was another woman with them. Paige. I clutched my coffee cup. Her friend. That's exactly right. Paige Holloway. They used valid passports, all legal. But how? I stammered. How did she manage to get a passport for Ethan? You need my permission for that. Dad and Donovan looked over at me. Son, Dad put some kind of document in front of me. Did you sign this? I glanced at the paper. A consent to apply for a passport for a minor. At the bottom was my signature. No, I didn't. And then, a memory struck like lightning. 3 weeks ago, a pile of paperwork for Ethan's school trip to the museum. Valencia held out some papers, And I signed without looking. God, she planned the whole thing, all this time. We checked her bank transactions over the last few months, Donovan continued. She's been gradually transferring small amounts into a Mexican bank account. Nothing suspicious. It could have appeared to be routine transfers to relatives. I remembered Valencia talking about helping her sick aunt in Mexico. How could I have been so blind? What about Paige? I asked, trying to gather my thoughts. Miss Holloway bought plane tickets 2 weeks ago. She was transferring money to Mexico, too. It looks like they planned it together. I stood up, walked over to the window. Everything was still the same in the garden. My mom's rose bushes, the old swing I'd once rocked little Ethan on. Nothing had changed here while my life was falling apart. There's something else. My dad's voice sounded strange. I think you need to know it. I turned around. Dad pulled some old folder out of his briefcase. Do you remember why we had that fight 10 years ago? Of course. You were against my decision to open a gym, wanted me to follow in your footsteps. No, he shook his head. That wasn't the only reason. I made inquiries about Valencia back when you two first started dating. Inside, everything went cold. What? It's standard procedure for military families to check out prospective in-laws. And I found something unpleasant. He opened the folder, pulled out old photos. Valencia, but younger, with a different hairstyle. Next to her, some man. Her first husband? Dad put the photos on the table. The marriage was short-lived, less than a year. She divorced 2 years before she met you. But that's not the point. She took all his savings and disappeared. Just like she is now. I slumped back in my chair, trying to comprehend what I'd heard. Why? Why didn't you tell me? I tried. Dad rubbed the bridge of his nose. The night we had the fight. But you didn't want to listen. Said I was trying to control your life, that it was all lies. Memories of that night came flooding back. I really didn't let him finish, yelling something about how he had no right to interfere in my life. And you just backed off? What could I have done? There was bitterness in his voice. You were in love, sure you were right. I hoped I was wrong. That maybe she had changed. I stared at the pictures, unable to tear my gaze away. The same smile, the same eyes. How could she? Twice. Planned, in cold blood. I need some air. I stood up, nearly knocking over my chair. I sprinted out into the garden, greedily gulping in the cool morning air. My head was spinning. 10 years. 10 years I'd lived with a man who'd already done this once. And now she'd taken not only the money, but my son as well. The door creaked behind him. The father came out next. I'm sorry, son. He put his hand on my shoulder. For the first time in years. All these years. My voice trailed off. All these years you knew and kept quiet? Every day I thought about telling, especially when Ethan was born, but you were happy, and I thought maybe this time would be different. I looked down at my hands. The wedding ring was still on my ring finger, a symbol of a marriage based on a lie. What now? I asked, looking at the rose bushes. Mom always said that roses, like love, require constant care. Otherwise, they die. Now? Dad squeezed my shoulder tighter. Now we'll get your son back. And with the haul, we'll figure something out. The phone vibrated in my pocket. The bank again. I didn't answer it. All these problems seemed so petty now compared to what I'd learned. Let's go. My father turned me toward the house. Michael's waiting. He has more information about her relatives in Mexico City. I nodded, but before I went in, I took the ring off my finger. It jingled quietly, falling into my jeans pocket, a small metal symbol of broken trust. Mexico City greeted us with stifling heat and chaos of sounds. After a 4-hour flight, my head was buzzing and my heart was pounding at the thought that somewhere in this huge city was my son. My father walked beside me, confidently maneuvering between the streams of people at the airport. In the 3 days since Valencia had disappeared, he'd made more connections than I'd ever imagined. Ramirez is supposed to meet us. Dad glanced at his watch. He works for the local police. He'll help with the paperwork. I nodded, absently clutching Ethan's drawing in my pocket, the one with the dinosaurs I'd taken from home. The only thing I had left. The gym had to close, temporarily, as I'd told Sarah, but we both knew that was the end of it. The bank had already started foreclosure proceedings. "Senor Ramsey?" A stocky man in a light-colored shirt approached us. "Bienvenidos a Mexico. I'm Juan Ramirez." We shook hands. Ramirez smelled of cigarettes and cologne, his tanned face furrowed with deep wrinkles. "I have a car." He picked up our bags. "And information on your wife." On the way back from the airport, I stared out the window at the city floating by. The bright colors, the graffiti on the walls, the street vendors, the laundry hanging between the houses. It all seemed like the set of some movie. Valencia often talked about this city, but her stories never conveyed that sense of chaotic energy. We checked her aunt's address. Ramirez drove, deftly maneuvering between buses and motorcycles. Coyocan neighborhood, but no one's been there for a week. A week? I stepped forward. "You mean they've been preparing this place in advance?" "See, the neighbors say they saw a woman with a baby 2 days ago, but they left quickly." The father was writing something down in his notebook. These days, he had become a real investigator gathering information, analyzing data, building theories. I felt increasingly helpless. The hotel Ramirez had chosen was in a relatively quiet neighborhood. It was a small room with 2 beds, the air conditioner humming in the corner. A reproduction of some painting hung on the wall, brightly colored flowers like the ones Valencia kept in her store. "Get some rest." Her father placed the bag on the bed. "Ramirez and I will go check out a few addresses." "I'll go with you." I stood up. "No." His tone tolerated no objection. "You haven't slept properly in 3 days, and you're too emotional right now. It could ruin everything." I wanted to object, but I realized he was right. My hands were still shaking, and my head was foggy from lack of sleep and worry. When they left, I lay on the bed without undressing. From the open window came the sounds of the city music, voices, car horns. Somewhere out there, amidst the noise, was my son. Is he asleep? Does he miss home? For me? Pulled out my phone. Dozens of missed ones from customers at the lounge. Messages from Sarah. Notifications from the bank. Opened the gallery. The latest video of Ethan from 4 days ago. He was showing me his new drawing, laughing, talking about school. "Te extraño, papá?" His voice with a slight Spanish accent adopted from his mother. "I miss you, papá," he always said when I was away on business. But then I always came back. There was a knock at the door. The maid brought fresh towels. I refused, but she came in anyway, saying something quickly in Spanish. Valencia tried to teach me the language, but I always found excuses. Too busy, too tired. So many missed opportunities. My phone vibrated. A message from my father. "Got a lead. We'll be there in an hour." I got up, went to the window. There were kids playing downstairs, about Ethan's age. One boy was flying a kite, just like the one my son and I had flown in the park a month ago. Ethan had been so excited when the kite finally flew. In the bathroom, I splashed water on my face and looked in the mirror. Something familiar flashed in the reflection, the same way my father had looked after my grandfather died, the same lost look, the same stamp of fatigue on his face. It was starting to rain outside. The drops drummed on the tin eaves, creating a strange melody. Valencia loved rain, always said it cleansed the soul. I wonder if the rain cleansed her conscience after what she had done. Footsteps were heard in the hallway. Her father had returned earlier than promised. 1. Ramirez stayed behind to check other addresses. He sat back in his chair, pulling out a clipboard. "But we have something interesting." A picture appeared on the screen of a surveillance camera in some store. Valencia and Ethan walking through the door. The date is yesterday. "Where is it?" I pitched forward. "A supermarket in the Polanco neighborhood. Rich neighborhood, lots of foreigners. They were there for about an hour." "Ethan, how does he look? Is he okay?" My father zoomed in on the image. My son was holding his mother's hand, some kind of toy in the other. He looked fine, even smiling. "The salesman memorized them," the father continued. "Said the boy kept asking about dinosaurs. They bought some toys and groceries." I stared at the picture, trying to memorize every detail. Ethan was wearing a new t-shirt, so they'd gone shopping. His hair had grown back a little. Time for a trim. "There's one more thing." Dad pulled out some papers. Paige Holloway rented an apartment in this neighborhood a month ago. Paid 3 months' rent in advance. A month ago? I felt everything inside clench. You mean they've been planning it? All this time? Yes. And here's the interesting thing. The apartment is in a fake name, but the electricity and water were turned on there the day before they arrived. I stood up, started pacing around the room. My thoughts were jumbled. They're somewhere close, in this huge city. My son is quite close. Sit down. My father tapped the table. We need to proceed according to plan, no amateurishness. What plan? It's been a week already. They could go somewhere else at any moment. That's why we have to proceed with caution. He pulled out a map of the city. Ramirez has set up surveillance on the apartment. If they're there, we'll know. In the meantime, before he could finish, there was a knock at the door. Ramirez stood on the threshold, wet from the rain. Tenemos un problema, he said quickly in Spanish. Dad frowned. What happened? They were spotted at the airport. They bought tickets for tomorrow's flight to Cancun. Cancun is a resort town on the other side of the country. You can fly anywhere from there. How much time do we have? Dad's voice sounded calm, but I could see the jaundices in his cheekbones tense. Flight's at 10 in the morning. Dad glanced at his watch. 7 p.m., 15 hours. Then we'll have to move faster than we planned. He unfolded the map on the table. Juan, are your men still watching the apartment? See, Colonel. They just reported the lights are on. There's movement inside. I looked back and forth at my father and Ramirez, feeling my heart ready to jump out of my chest. 15 hours. Just 15 hours to find and bring my son back. Change of plan. My father pulled out his cell phone. We need to act tonight. Outside the window, thunder rumbled. The rain intensified. Somewhere in the darkness of this foreign city, the fate of my family was being decided. The rain turned the streets of Mexico City into a mirrored canvas, reflecting neon signs and the headlights of passing cars. We were sitting in Ramirez's inconspicuous van, parked 3 houses away from the building. My father was quietly discussing something with the local cops, and I couldn't take my eyes off the 5th-floor windows, where the lights were dimmed. It was nearing midnight. The TV was on in the apartment across the hall, its flickering light casting bizarre shadows. A dog was barking somewhere, and the sounds of Latin American music were coming from the open window. An ordinary evening in a bedroom neighborhood in Mexico City, for everyone but us. Are they definitely in there? I asked Ramirez for the 100th time. Si, senor. My men saw them coming back 2 hours ago. A woman, a child, and another lady. Paige. Her betrayal felt especially acute. How many times she sat at our house playing with Ethan, giving parenting advice, and all the while helping Valencia plan her escape. Here, Dad held out a bottle of water to me. You need to get in shape. I took a sip. The water was warm and smelled like plastic, but that didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the windows on the 5th floor. Remember what we discussed? Dad put his hand on my shoulder. No amateurishness. We're doing everything according to plan. The plan was simple. Wait until the lights went out in the apartment, then go up the fire escape. Ramirez had a warrant something to do with suspected financial fraud. A formality, but enough for legal entry. Time. Ramirez glanced at his watch. They usually turn the lights off around midnight. I nodded, feeling my heart racing. So much time had passed since I'd discovered the empty house. So many sleepless nights, full of nightmares and memories. In my pocket was Ethan's crumpled drawing of the same family of 3 holding hands. I wondered if he was drawing now. Valencia had always encouraged his passion for art, bought him sketchbooks and paints. The light in the windows flickered and went out. Everyone in the van tensed. Wait 15 minutes, Dad commanded. Let them sleep. Those 15 minutes seemed like an eternity. I looked at my watch, watching the second hand creep slowly. I remembered our last night together as usual. Nothing seemed to portend trouble. Ethan was showing off a new drawing of a dinosaur. Valencia was making dinner. It's time. My dad's voice snapped me out of my memories. We got out of the van 4 policemen, Ramirez, my dad, and me. The rain had almost stopped, But the air was damp and heavy. The fire escape glistened wetly in the light of the street lamps. The climb took a few minutes. I tried not to look down, focusing on the metal steps in front of me. Somewhere upstairs, very close, my son was sleeping. On the 5th-floor landing, Ramirez signaled for me to wait. He pulled out a walkie-talkie, said something quietly in Spanish. There was a crackle, and somewhere downstairs an engine started. The second group was taking up position at the main entrance. My father handed me a bulletproof vest. "Put it on. We don't know what's inside." "You think they might have weapons?" I struggled to fasten the Velcro with shaky hands. "Better to be reassured." Ramirez pulled out a warrant, nodded to his men. One of the cops stood at the door with a battering ram. "On 3, Ramirez whispered. "Uno, dos." The rattle of the battering ram broke the silence of the night. The door did not yield immediately. It took 2 blows. A light flashed inside and a woman's scream rang out. "Policia!" yelled Ramirez, bursting into the apartment. Everything happened like a blur. I remember running into the hallway, hearing stomping feet and screams. When I opened the first door, an empty bedroom with a disassembled bed. The second, a bathroom. "Alto! Freeze!" Ramirez's shout from the depths of the apartment. I rushed toward the voice. In the living room, slumped against the wall, stood Paige. In silk pajamas, her face contorted with fear. 2 police officers were holding Valencia. She was yelling something in Spanish, trying to break free. "¿Dónde está el niño? Where is the child?" Ramirez demanded. "Ethan!" I rushed into the last room. He was asleep on a small bed covered in a familiar dinosaur blanket. A tattered plush Tyrannosaurus, his favorite sleep toy, lay next to him. A moon-shaped nightlight glowed in the headboard, the exact same one he had at home. "Daddy?" A sleepy voice, frightened eyes. I dropped to my knees next to the bed and pulled him against me, feeling tears streaming down my cheeks. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. I'm here." "Don't touch him!" Valencia shouted from the living room. "You have no right!" I lifted Ethan into my arms. He was about to fall asleep again, tucked into my shoulder. In the living room, Ramirez was reading out his driver's license. One of the cops was handcuffing Paige. "You don't understand." Valencia switched to English, looking me in the eye. "I was doing it for him, for us." "For us?" My voice shook with restrained rage. "You stole my son, took all the money, ruined my business." "Your business," she laughed bitterly. "It's always just your business, your gym, your clients, your training, and Ethan and I have always come second." "That's not true." I cradled my son tighter. He stirred in his sleep, mumbling something. "It is true. When was the last time you went to his school events? When you spent a weekend with him outside of your gym? He's growing up without a father, even with you around." Her words hurt more than any blows, because there was some truth to them. How many times had I missed family dinners because of late workouts? How many times had I canceled trips to the park because of an emergency at the gym? And that's an excuse to steal a kid from his dad? The father's voice came from the doorway. An excuse to ruin someone else's life? Valencia froze when she saw him. You have no right to be here." "I have, just as I had the right to warn my son 10 years ago." "Too bad he didn't listen." "Señores," Ramirez stepped forward. "We should get going. The car is waiting downstairs." "No!" Valencia jerked toward us. "You can't take him. I need him." "You should have thought of that before." I turned to leave. "Before you decided to repeat your old trick." She froze. "What?" "I know about your first husband, about how you ripped him off and ran away. Is that your signature move? Fall in love, gain his trust, then rob him and disappear?" A heavy silence hung in the room, broken only by the quiet breathing of a sleeping Ethan. "You don't know anything." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't know what I've been through. And I'll never know again." I stepped out into the hallway, feeling my legs shaking. My father followed, holding his phone at the ready. There was a car waiting downstairs to take us to safety. Behind us were Valencia's muffled sobs and Ramirez's voice reading out the driver's license. In the car, Ethan woke up, looking around fearfully. "Where's Mom?" Mom has some things to take care of." I stroked his head, feeling my heart clench. "We're going to go home, okay? And my dinosaurs?" His bottom lip trembled. "I'll buy you new ones, kid. Any ones you want." He nodded, snuggling against me again. The top of his head smelled like baby shampoo, the same shampoo Valencia had used to wash him since he was born. His father sat in the front, talking quietly with the driver. In the rearview mirror, I could see his face tense. He'd aged over the days, new wrinkles appearing. The car drove through the night city. Somewhere behind, in a police van, Valencia and Paige were being taken away. Ahead of them was a long journey home and an unknown future without his favorite business, without money, with a small son in his arms. But none of that mattered now. Now I held in my hands the most important thing, my child alive and unharmed. Everything else could be survived. "Daddy?" Ethan's sleepy voice said. "You're not leaving now?" "No, baby." I kissed the top of his head. "I'll always be there for you now." The police station in downtown Mexico City buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Despite the late hour, there were people scurrying around in the hallways, phones ringing, and a printer working somewhere in the distance. Ethan was asleep on the couch in Ramirez's office, covered by my jacket. In his sleep, his face seemed so serene, like the last few days had just been a bad dream. "Coffee?" My father held out a plastic cup to me. His face showed fatigue, his shirt was wrinkled, but his posture was still impeccably straight. The military bearing hadn't gone anywhere. "Thanks." I took the glass. Fatigue came in waves, but I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts were swirling around in my head. Behind the glass partition, I could see Ramirez talking to some man in an austere suit. A diplomat? A lawyer? The whole thing seemed unreal, like a scene from a bad movie. "They want you to talk to her." Dad sat down next to me. "Before we leave." "Why? What else is there to say?" "Maybe you need this, to understand, to let go." I looked at my sleeping son. His plush dinosaur was lying on the floor. I picked up the toy, placed it next to him. How many times had I put him to bed at home without realizing that each night could be his last? "Okay," I finished my coffee. "Where is she?" The interrogation room was small and stuffy. Valencia sat at her desk, hunched over, like I'd never seen her before. Always well-groomed, with perfect posture, she looked haggard now. Her long black hair was disheveled, her mascara smudged under her eyes. "Bright." She looked up as I walked in. Be quiet." I sat down across from her. "Just answer me one question. Why?" She still had her wedding ring on her ring finger, the same one I'd put on her finger 8 years ago. "You wouldn't understand. Try explaining. I have a right to know why you destroyed our family." She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. "Remember how we met? At that charity marathon? You were so lively, full of enthusiasm, talking about your dreams, the future of the gym. What's that got to do with it?" "What it has to do with is that Brighton is dead, gone. All that's left is the fitness club owner, always busy, always solving some problem." Her voice shook. "Do you know when Ethan started walking? When he said his first word? No, because you weren't around, you were in the audience. I was providing for a family." "A family?" She grinned bitterly. "Family isn't just about money, Bright. It's time together. It's conversations, walks, shared breakfasts. And that's why you decided to steal our son? Take all the money?" "The money?" She shook her head. "You didn't even notice that for the last 6 months I barely slept at night, that I cried in the bathroom while you were at work, that Ethan was asking more and more often why Dad wasn't coming to his shows at school." I clenched my fists under the table. Every word she said hit exactly on target, finding pain points I didn't even know existed. "And your first husband? Wasn't family life enough with him either?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "So your father told—" She was quiet. "Yes, I took his money. Because he used to beat me up. Every night after work, every time I made dinner wrong or talked too long on the phone. Money was the only way I could escape." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the ground go from under my feet. In 8 years of marriage, she'd never once talked about it. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Did you ask?" She smiled bitterly. "Have you noticed anything at all besides your haul these past years?" Footsteps sounded in the hallway. probably a police patrol. Somewhere in the distance, a baby was crying. I thought of Ethan sleeping in Ramirez's office. What now? I asked, looking at her hands, so familiar, with neat manicures and thin silver rings. Now? She looked up. Now you're going to take Ethan. You're going to take him home to your empty apartment. You'll try to combine fatherhood with work, if you can save your haul, of course. And me. I'm going back to Mexico, when this whole police thing is over. You could have just talked to me, told me something was wrong. I did, many times. But you didn't hear me, or didn't want to hear. There was a knock on the door. Ramirez. Time was up. Wait, Valencia held out her hand as I stood up. Tell Ethan, tell him that Mom loves him, that none of this was about him. I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for 8 years, the mother of my son, the person I didn't happen to know at all. You know what the worst part is? I said, standing at the door. That you're right. I've really stopped noticing the main thing. But your way of solving the problem? It hurt everyone, especially Ethan. I know, she lowered her head. I just didn't see any other way out. When I came out, my father was waiting in the hallway. You could see it in his face. He'd heard everything. Son, don't. I held up my hand. Just, let's take Ethan and go home. In Ramirez's office, Ethan was still asleep. I gently lifted him into my arms. He mumbled something in his sleep, snuggled against my chest. So small, so defenseless. The car's waiting. Dad opened the door. The plane's in 3 hours. It was beginning to dawn outside. The sky in the east was brightening, coloring the clouds a soft pink. Birds were singing somewhere. A huge city was waking up. A typical morning in Mexico City. I got into the car, cradling my son in my arms. There was a long road home ahead, and an even longer road to rebuilding our lives. But right now, looking at Ethan sleeping, I knew only one thing. I would never make the same mistakes again. Dad, came my son's sleepy voice. Are we going home? Yes, baby, we're going home. Outside the window, the streets of Mexico City floated by, the city that changed our lives forever. The city where I lost my wife but rediscovered my son and father. And Mom? His question hung in the air. I kissed the top of his head, feeling a lump rise to my throat. Mom, Mommy needs to be here for a while, but she loves you very much, and she always will. Ethan nodded and closed his eyes again. Mexico City's airport buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Announcements in Spanish and English blended into a steady stream of sounds echoing off the high ceilings and glass walls. Ethan sat next to me in the waiting room, enthusiastically coloring the new dinosaur book his dad had bought him at the gift store. Look, Dad. He showed me a drawing of a Tyrannosaurus, painstakingly colored purple. That's the scariest predator. It's very beautiful. I stroked his head, feeling my heart clench. Even such a simple gesture now seemed special, precious. Dad came back with coffee and juice for Ethan. It was as if he'd gotten younger over the days, some new energy in his movements, a sparkle in his eyes. It was as if the opportunity to help his son, the chance to make things right, had breathed new life into him. The flight is delayed for an hour. He sat down next to me, handing me a cup of coffee. Technical reasons. I nodded, looking around at the crowd of people rushing somewhere. Each dark-haired woman made my heart clench. Wasn't that Valencia? Wouldn't she be coming to say goodbye? Don't think about it, my father said as if he'd read my mind. It'll be easier this way. Easier? I grinned bitterly. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that his mother won't be living with us anymore, that things have changed? Kids are smarter than we think. He looked at Ethan, who had now started drawing a flying pterodactyl. They sense the truth, and they're amazingly adaptable. The big window of the terminal showed airplanes taking off, silvery birds taking people off to new beginnings or bringing them home. Where will this day take us? Ramirez approached us, impeccably dressed as always, despite the early hour. Can I talk to you for a minute? I stood up, glancing at Ethan. His father was already leaning over his coloring book, saying something about ancient reptiles. There's news from Senora Valencia. Ramirez took me aside. She asked me to give this to you. He held out an envelope, a plain, white, unmarked envelope, just like the one I'd found at home that terrible day. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter and a small picture of Ethan, a toddler, sleeping in his crib, cuddling his stuffed dinosaur. I remembered that day, his first day home after the birth center. Valencia had said then that she'd never seen anything more beautiful. "Dear Bright," the letter began, "by the time you read this, we will be far apart. Perhaps that is for the best. I don't apologize for my actions, though I realize now that I chose the wrong path. But I do ask you for one thing. Don't let our mistakes affect Ethan. He deserves a happy childhood. He deserves a father who will be there for him. Don't make the same mistakes. Don't let work replace family. And someday when he's old enough, tell him the truth. The whole truth about my mistakes and yours. Let him know that love is different, and sometimes it hurts even those we love the most." At the end of the letter, there was a note. "I left the documents for the store with my lawyer. Sell it. The money should be enough to save your gym. It's the least I can do." "Dad!" Ethan's voice snapped me out of my daze. "Look what Grandpa showed me." I hastily wiped my eyes, hiding the letter in the inside pocket of my jacket. Ethan held out his drawing to me. Now 3 human figures had been added to the dinosaurs. "That's us," he pointed with his finger. "You, me, and Grandpa. And the dinosaurs are guarding us." "Beautiful drawing, kid," I hugged him. "The best one yet. And you can draw Mommy here." He pointed to the empty space next to the figures. "When she gets back." I met my father's gaze. The same pain that tormented me was in his eyes. "Attention! Boarding for the flight is about to begin. This is ours." My father stood up, gathering our few belongings. "It's time." Ethan stacked his pencils in his new pencil case, another gift from the gift store. His movements were so casual, childlike, like the last few days had just been a weird adventure. At the gate, I turned around one last time. A huge airport hall, filled with people, each with their own story, their own sorrows and joys. Somewhere out there in that city, a part of my life remained. The woman I loved, who gave me a son and taught me how to love. And betrayed. "Ready?" My father put his hand on my shoulder. "No," I answered honestly. "But there's no choice." Ethan took my hand. His small palm was warm and trusting. In his other hand, he held his stuffed dinosaur tightly. "Daddy, are we going to go to the gym at home? I want to show Grandpa how I learned to do push-ups." "Sure, kiddo." I squeezed his hand. "We'll definitely go." "And to the park?" His eyes lit up. "You promised to teach me how to ride a bike." "And to the park," I smiled, feeling his words make my heart warm. Now we'll have plenty of time for everything. We walked down the long hallway to the plane, my dad in front with our bags, me with Ethan by the hand, and each step took us further away from the past and closer to our new lives. "Passengers with children board first," a pleasant female voice announced in Spanish and English. "That's about us," Ethan rejoiced. "Yes, baby." I picked him up in my arms, feeling something elusively familiar. "It's about us."